I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. We're bringing together experts, thinkers, and leaders, busting myths, sharing stories, and staying connected when Canadians need it the most. We're having unexpected conversations for unprecedented times. Hi, everyone. Like many of you, I am working on trying to educate myself and be more than just an ally. I've been participating in a conference that is being put on by Cicely Blaine Consulting and their amazing team. And I am very fortunate to have Cicely here with us to talk or have a conversation about racism and how we can all work towards being better. So Cicely, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
I am too. So why don't you, is it okay if you just explain what happens at Cicely Blaine Consulting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we are a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting company based here in Vancouver, but we do work with clients all over the world, in fact. And our mission is really to support people in understanding issues of systemic injustice and how that shows up in the workplace, how harassment and discrimination show up in the workplace, and really to give people the tools to combat those things and create more inclusive and welcoming and sustainable work environments for people of all backgrounds.
Now, I discovered your company on Instagram when I was trying to find ways where I could educate myself and be an active listener. Have you seen your business? You have clients all over the world. Have you seen your business increase in the last few months?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the kind of really integral focus on anti-racism right now over the past few even just the past few weeks has really kind of zoomed in on exposing racism in different ways. And I think that's really, I think it's doing a few things. It's kind of drawing attention to racism in the workplace, racism in our communities, individual sort of complicity in racist power structures. And that's really opening up a lot of people's eyes to how they might be inadvertently perpetuating racism in their workplace, or letting racism go by just because they don't necessarily have the skills and the tools to see or address it. And so that, I think, has really pushed a lot of people in the last few weeks to get in touch. We saw a 1,000% increase of traffic on our website, especially after the George Floyd incident. I think people even there's a lot of people who were already doing this work and already interested, but I think that really kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to injustice and to talking about Black Lives Matter, to talking about racism. I think especially in Canada, it can be a bit of an uncomfortable or taboo subject. But I think now we've moved into into a new society whereby it's okay to talk openly and publicly about racism, and in fact it's necessary. And I think a lot of people are finally coming on board with that. And so we've really seen lots of people reaching out and reaching out for long-term work as well, which I think is really important. We do a lot of one-off workshops, which I think have a lot of value and are really great for folks to learn. But I also think it's really important for people to be doing long-term work, like, developing policies and, doing, analysis of the programming. What kind of communities are you reaching with your work? How do people feel when they walk through the door? And yeah, it's really amazing to see that long-term work happening in addition to workshops too.
What do you think what was it about George Floyd's death? Because we know that he is not the only Black man to die at the hands of police in front of us on television. We've seen this before. But what was it about George Floyd's death that really made people speak up and say enough?
I think it's a combination of so many things. Like, yeah, I'm still asking myself that question, because I think for me and many other Black activists, this is not new. This is something that we see, weekly. We see these stories coming in that maybe a fraction of them touch mainstream media, but we're sort of very cognizant of all of them. And so it doesn't really, for us, doesn't feel much different. I think one of the things that's changed is of course the pandemic, and the year that is 2020, and how so much is changing in our society, and the way that we relate to each other is changing. I think a sense of coming together has happened. In in a public health crisis, we've sort of realized the necessity of caring for one another and coming together, and allyship, which I think has spurred on a lot of people to pay attention to other people's needs and other people's experiences. And I also think the pandemic has really exposed a lot of systemic injustices, whether racism or otherwise. I think Canada took a little bit of a while to get on board, but we did begin to see a lot of race-based data about COVID, and about which communities are disproportionately impacted by COVID. I think we started to recognize the importance of frontline workers, many of whom are people of color, many of whom are underpaid, and so we started collectively to recognize systemic injustice, and how we have to care for the most marginalized, and liberation of the most marginalized leads to a better society for us all. And then, of course, added to the fact that we're now have a lot more free time, whether for the better or worse, or, are using social media potentially a lot more than before. I think it's just a lot all coming to head at once. And that really drew people's attention to to what Black Lives Matter chapters and other black activists and other Black focused organizations have been speaking about for years, for decades even. So on one hand, it is confusing. I think it is like, okay, we were talking about this for years, why suddenly? But on the other hand, it is also validating to to finally have such national and international galvanization around this issue that's been so dear to many of us for a long time.
Some people listening may not recognize that you are one of the co-founders of the Vancouver chapter of Black Lives Matter. Do you think there's a feeling in Canada that we don't have a problem when it comes to racism towards Black people? It's more of an American thing.
Definitely. I think that is actually one of the biggest ways that racism manifests here in Canada, is the denial of racism itself, which really doubles down on the experience of racism for folks of color, especially for Black people. I think we are very obsessed with kind of making a comparison between Canada and the United States, and saying we're better than the United States is, setting ourselves a pretty low bar. So I don't think it's really helpful or additive to make that comparison. I also often hear people making the comparison of, do Black or Indigenous people have a worse experience? And again, I think those questions kind of detract from the fact that anti-racism work is anti-racism work, and anti-racism work helps everyone. We are all complicit in and impacted by racism, regardless of who we are. Obviously, some more than others, some in more extreme ways than others. But any sort of any sort of anti-racist initiative like Black Lives Matter really is is part of the liberation for all people of color, and part of the end of all kinds of systemic oppression. Black Lives Matter, and one of the things that was really powerful for me when I was an organizer is how intersectional the movement is, and how it's beyond just race. It's about Black trans lives, it's about Black queer lives, Black people with disabilities. It's all of these intersectional identities, and I think that's something that's always felt really powerful to me within the Black Lives Matter movement, and something that I think has really evolved in Black liberation activism in general. If we compare it to the civil rights, for example, which people often do, I think so much incredible progress has been made in terms of like which Black voices are being centered, and how Black people's activism work, really does benefit the rest of society. And, when people hear the term Black Lives Matter, folks who don't really understand the purpose of the movement do get sensitive, or do get stressed about like what it means. But really it's just an affirmation or an assertion that Black lives are being and have always been persecuted or targeted or criminalized in particular ways. It's not to say other lives don't matter or Black lives matter more. It's really to to focus on and uplift a community that's being marginalized in a specific way. And when that work is done, or as that work is being done, other people benefit too, which I think is one of the most incredible things about this movement.
So let's talk about some of the things that we hear. So when all lives matter, why is that harmful?
Mm-hmm. It's an erasure. I always liken it back to the fact that nobody said all lives matter until somebody said Black Lives Matter. We all know that, yes, in theory, all lives do matter. Everybody is important, but certain groups, certain communities are being and have been oppressed, marginalized, disenfranchised, excluded, targeted, persecuted, you name it. And so therefore the statement Black Lives Matter is essential as if nothing else, as a reminder of that, as a reminder of existing injustices. We don't need to say white lives matter, for example, because our society centers and uplifts and focuses on the experiences of white folks. And so we need to say Black Lives Matter as a reminder that Black people are just as important. And yeah, as I say, nobody's saying more than. It's about equalizing experience through a lens of equity. And it's a reminder at the basis. The phrase itself is just a reminder in a society that often forgets that Black lives do matter.
Now, when you talk about centering, people might not understand what that means, to center it. So can you explain that?
Yeah, I think when we say centering, I typically think about representation, for example. When we look at the books we read, the things we watch on TV, the curriculum that we learn in school, and, the curriculum that healthcare professionals learn when they're learning how to treat different body types, the language that we speak. There's a specific image of a person who is given the central role, and then everybody who doesn't fit with that image, physically, linguistically, psychologically, neurotypically, their needs will never be met in a society where one particular type of person is the basis of how we make decisions or how we do things. Like, one thing that's really interesting to me is, I was reading this amazing article, and it was talking about how sexism in car design actually means that women are at higher risk of dying in car crashes, because when they design airbags, for example, or when they design seatbelts, it's based on what they call average man, and it's a 70-pound white man. The majority of people do not have that body type. And so it means that you're at greater risk if the safety precautions are not designed around you and your body type. So that's just one example, but it can go into so many different ways. Another thing that's important to me is this idea of professionalism, for example, and who's, how quote unquote professionalism is, having like neat hair, as it were, or like wearing a particular suit, and that's not accessible for everyone, or talking in a particular way that's not accessible for everyone. And so everyone who doesn't fit with this like predefined societal narrative is then on the outside, or experiences some form of access barrier to being part of the workplace, for example.
Mm-hmm. What about white privilege? Some people, I should say, get very offended by the words white privilege. Do you think people understand what it means? Or how can you help us understand what it means?
I think people get sensitive about the term privilege because it feels like, or it can feel like, an erasure of your other experiences. And I think the most common understanding of privilege is around wealth. I think before we use the language of white privilege, privilege on its own typically meant being rich, or, having access, living a comfortable life, having access to more things. And I think as, anti-racist critique began to evolve, as social justice and intersectional feminism began to evolve, we began to look critically at other ways privilege can give you an advantage in life. And we began to understand, even if you are a working class person and you're white, that whiteness can give you certain privileges, maybe not all, because you might be held back in certain areas by your access to capital or how much money you have, or by a disability, or by being queer, or by being trans. But being white is affording you some access to safety is a huge one. Respect, being perceived as intelligent, or, societal beauty standards are also very much based around whiteness. So I think it is very hard for people to understand. And I definitely don't think it's something that you can just sort of come to terms with overnight. I think it really is a lifelong process of understanding how your privilege has enabled you to get ahead, or to, get your foot in the door maybe where other people can't, because of how people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people in North America, have been systemically excluded from being part of our capitalist society. Things like land ownership and, business ownership are huge ways that we as people in North America have access to being equal citizens, and that's something that has been intentionally and systemically denied to a lot of people of color, immigrants, people who were formerly slaves, and Indigenous people. So yeah, it's definitely hard for people to recognize, because maybe in your day-to-day experience, you might go through a lot of struggle, you might have a lot of hardship, but if you're white, you don't have that hardship because you are white. And I think that's something that, yeah, as I say, can take a while for people to grapple with, but I think it's important for people to just kind of notice, things as simple as, like, who gets to push to the front of the line at a grocery store and not be questioned, or like who gets pulled over by the cops and who doesn't, things like this, where, and I think also with privilege, it means that other people's experiences are invisible to you. And so it can be really hard to even notice, because you're just living your life, going about, like, something that I think about often as an able-bodied person is how easy it is for me to walk around town. I can walk upstairs, I can get on the bus. I very rarely think about, oh, what if I couldn't get into this building? Or what if I go to an event and there's no sign language interpretation? Like, because that's not my lived experience, I'm just not thinking about it. And I think that's what privilege does, is it makes other people's hardships, harder for us to understand.
Mm-hmm. I like what you had on your Instagram account, your company's Instagram account, where it was, white privilege doesn't take away from your own hard experiences. It's just to understand that the color of your skin has made it easier for you in many aspects of life, just for being born white. You don't control that, but once you recognize it, once you have that in your head, it really changes your perspective on everything. Once you understand what white privilege is. What about the difference between what is an anti-racist? I can walk around and say, well, I'm not racist, Cicely. I am not racist. But that's not good enough. I need to be anti-racist. What is that?
I think the difference is, a lot of people are very quick to say, I'm not racist, in reaction to somebody calling out maybe a specific racist thing that they did. And I think we, as human beings, like, I like to kind of differentiate between the idea of guilt and shame. And I think sometimes we feel shame when we're told, okay, that was a racist thing. And we feel like, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. I've made such a huge mistake. I can never come back from this. And shame is not helpful. Like, it doesn't allow us to grow or be better allies, or, contribute meaningfully to community. Whereas I think guilt is a recognition that maybe one or two things you did, or things you said in the past, or even things your ancestors did, were bad. But as long as you learn and grow and make amends and make reparations, it doesn't negate your future commitments to anti-racism. So I think, being an anti-racist is about recognizing past mistakes or your own unconscious internalized biases, and being consistent about it as well. Like I see anti-racism as a process, as a journey of thinking critically about literally everything that we engage in, because as I said, it's not necessarily our fault as people in the 21st century. Like the systems that we've inherited, a lot of them are built on the marginalization and persecution of particular communities and particular cultures, especially in a settler colonial state. That's traumatic and horrifying things happen. And it's not to say that they are the fault of us in the present day, but I do think we have to be very active and strategic about then what do we do, then how do we engage, then how do we have conversations, how do we call other people in to be in this fight with us. And I think there's also a misconception that anti-racism work is the work of people of color, but actually it's the work of all of us. And especially in Canada, where white folks are the majority, we need white folks on our side, engaging and doing anti-racism work as well. So yeah, for me, it's a critical lens. It's a lens through which we look at the world and we make decisions and we decide, what to buy, what not to buy, where to travel to, where to not travel to, how we talk to others. It's kind of a value-based lens of how we make decisions as human beings.
Mm. We've been hearing a lot in the media about defunding the police, and it seems very polarizing. Maybe because people don't understand what that means. Some people don't understand what it means to defund the police. Why is that important? Why is it important to defund the police? What does it mean in simple terms?
Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely can come across as alarming to a lot of folks because we have no other, here in North America, no other framework to base it on. We only know this current system. And so something as radical as removing something that seems or comes across to be integral to the functioning of our society, people can't compute something else. It almost feels like fantasy or like science fiction to imagine like this completely different like structure of society. So I think that's where a lot of the kind of immediate alarm is coming from. But I think the importance of these conversations around defunding the police is that so many attempts at reform have been made. This is not coming from nowhere. This is not like just a random idea. This is activists, consultants, organizers, reformers of all kinds have tried things, have tried unconscious bias training within policing, have tried, reduced funding, have tried having like a LGBTQ liaison within the police, have tried having the police marching in pride parades. And maybe individual police officers have changed their perspectives. Maybe a few people have changed and grown and become anti-racists. But structurally, systemically, the way policing functions hasn't changed, unfortunately. And so a new alternative is required whereby the resources and the funding, which is usually extremely disproportionate to other municipal or, civil service funding, it's not just taking away a small budget. It's also reckoning with the fact that policing is often overfunded in comparison to education, for example. And so it's a critical look at how do we reallocate funding into ways to keep all communities safe, because traditionally policing has functioned to keep very specific people safe, usually white middle class communities. And, policing in its early days originated from catching freed slaves, for example. And then policing has become very glorified as heroic and I think that has really sort of centralized it in our imagination of these are the only people who can keep us safe. But I think we need to rethink that, because clearly not everybody is kept safe. In fact, quite the opposite. Many people are directly harmed by police. And again, it's important for folks to think at the institutional level. I think people get lost in this discussion of what about the individual? When we have these conversations about police and pride, for example, people are like, what about gay police officers? great, just come as a person. Like, you don't need to come as a police officer. Like, people who work at Safeway don't come like with a grocery bag. Like, just come as yourself. And I think we need to have, and I think that's what's happening now, is a zoomed out lens where people are able to understand systemic racism, systemic oppression. And so, yeah, these conversations about defunding the police, I think, are really important and have the potential to recenter the narrative from criminalization, because the criminalization is usually of people who are just trying to survive. We're criminalizing people in poverty, homeless people who are being, um, arrested for camping outside. And, there's a lot of persecution of people just
Or
trying
George Floyd for
Yeah.
$20.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
Yeah. So what we're seeing is something else. We need to see something else. We need to see different ways of, it's not to say it's going to be like a free for all of crime, which I think, people jump to. But crime in whatever that may be, it is very closely linked to poverty and dissatisfaction and disenfranchisement and people feeling excluded and oppressed by our systems. And so, we need an upstream approach whereby how do we support folks first, and then, I think it really requires a new imaginative approach.
so when you talk about unconscious bias, that's come up a few times. We all have unconscious bias, don't we?
Mm-hmm. We sure do. Unconscious bias is such a tricky one, because I think, especially when I do unconscious bias as a workshop or as a training, I think people think they will leave having no biases at all, and that is humanly impossible. It is just a natural, inherent part of who we are. We are socialized to see the world in a particular way based on our upbringing, our geographical location, our identity. I think what we can do with bias is bring it to the surface and to critically think about how we make decisions and make sure that we're not making those decisions from a place of bias. I think maybe over time you can maybe de-bias yourself, but I think what's more important and what's more accessible to the average person is recognizing, oh, whoops, I have this bias where I think this part of town is dangerous when I actually haven't critically thought about it, or I have this bias where I think Black men are dangerous when, this is a bias that's been given to me by my parents, by the media, by our education system. There's so many biases, and from a psychological standpoint, the purpose of a bias is to help us make quick decisions. And especially as busy human beings, we fall back on these biases to make our lives easier. But I think what we can do is, once you know that you have a bias, once you've brought it to the surface, you can recognize, oh, am I making this decision out of bias? And then you can think, okay, what should I do instead? Bias is kind of our first thought. What makes you an anti-racist, or what makes you a better person, is then choosing not to make a decision out of a place of bias. And I think that's more doable, more feasible as a person, as opposed to thinking that you can eradicate every bias that you have.
We, when you and I were talking the other day, I brought up in the conference somebody, I can't remember who, because I've taken quite a few of the sessions, but it was around Black men and this bias that we all have, because for years we have been, I never looked at it this way, looking at how movies, stories are told about Black men, that they're dangerous. Maybe it's a character in a movie that we've seen, and we keep seeing that same storyline over and over again. There's this myth that Black people have thicker skin, so they don't feel pain. Many of them. So, and mostly that Black men are dangerous for white women. And these are bias that maybe, again, uncomfortable to talk about. uncomfortable to admit that you maybe have this unconscious bias. But how did we get to this place where we think that Black men are so scary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an intentional framing, and I think especially, you can't necessarily boil everything down to one event, but I do think slavery had a huge role to play in the perception and the treatment of Black folks in North America. So I'll mainly focus on that, but I think there was a very on purpose and intentional framing of Black people through the lens of gender. So for Black men, you know, slave owners were able to feel validated in their decision to enslave Black men because they perceived them as physically stronger and fitter, but also dangerous, and barbaric and savage and uncivilized. And so, therefore, this was, when they, I don't know, I don't really know how it worked, but like I guess when they went back to Europe and they were like, "Hey, we found these people. They would be great to pick cotton and whatever." It was very easy for them to make a case for that, right? And that kind of ideology has very much stuck with us based on this negative trope and this negative portrayal. And when we think about just because slavery was abolished, it lasted for over 300 years, and anything that lasts for that long is going to drastically inform the society that we live in. Slavery lasted for longer than it has been ended, so it's still informing the perception of Blackness, and especially Blackness and gender. And I think there's also this layer of white slave owners, who are typically men, perceiving that Black men were physically stronger than them but intellectually inferior, and so it was necessary to uphold that narrative in order to not be dominated by them, in a sense. And so that same narrative continues, and especially, as you say, the same narrative with the sort of innocent white woman sort of trope, that was also sort of created during that time, which removes white women from being complicit in some of these things. And kind of, as we were talking about white privilege, a lot of white women are like, "Oh, but I'm a woman, so I experience sexism and I experience discrimination in that regard," and don't necessarily connect themselves to whiteness and white privilege. So yeah, it's really complicated and deep rooted.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, we are just, especially in the 21st century, are inundated with these biases and these stereotypes anywhere you go. Like, you can't, you wake up in the morning and there's like an ad, or there's a movie, or there's a newspaper clipping, or like your parent says something. Like, we are just being fed these narratives like constantly, and yeah, so then it informs who we are, and it informs how we view others.
Systemic racism. So I've heard many people say, and many people in power say, that systemic racism doesn't exist in Canada. I believe it does. I know it does. Why is it so hard to admit that we have systemic racism? And why don't we as Canadians understand that? Why I find it extremely upsetting. And, as a white person, no one has ever judged me on the color of my skin. Or, so, and I guess it goes back to that being uncomfortable, right? And being, what do you say to Canadians who say we don't have systemic racism here in Canada?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I am also confused as to why it is such a mystery to a lot of people. I think because power becomes increasingly invisible, and I think because significant progress has been made, and Canada has always been, one of the forerunners in a lot of civil rights changes. Especially with like, gay marriage, for example. I think Canada was the fourth country in the world to legalize gay marriage. So, and Canada sort of managed to develop this image of being so inclusive and, you know, accepting, you know, welcoming Holocaust survivors after the war, and welcoming refugees, and the end of the Underground Railroad. And so Canada has had these opportunities to develop its whole national identity around being some sort of savior or being a safe haven. And that image has managed to act as a blanket over all other forms of systemic injustice. And I think also some of the most marginalized communities are also, you know, rural communities, indigenous communities in, you know, in northern Canada, who are sort of left out of our conversations and left out of the narrative. So it becomes increasingly easy to dismiss these stories, or cover them up. And yeah, the way that power functions in the present day is increasingly invisible. So I think, you know, 50 years ago, the way that we saw power was a lot more clear. You know, if you power was used as, you know, a way to like segregate, or like segregation was like a very clear, obvious structural thing, whereas now we maybe don't legally have those things, but we still socially have forms of segregation, right? We still socially have, sort of forms of ghettoization. We still have gentrification, but those are so invisibilized because it's such a, because they're so commonplace and they're so gradual. You know, a lot of the times here in Vancouver, we talk about Hogan's Alley as, you know, being the Black community that was erased. And so that's a very like overt and literal form, like the literal erasure of a whole community. But really, it was just a process of gentrification, and now that's happening in much sort of micro ways. You see a, you know, a new shiny shop popping up here, replacing like a mom and pop shop, or, you know, you see like a gym replacing, like a Chinese restaurant, and it's just slow and increasingly invisible as, you know, as certain groups get access to power. And it means the, you know, the more people in power, the more other people are being marginalized and oppressed. So I think, yeah, it's this nature of invisibilization, and also, yeah, Canada being able to cling onto this narrative, this idea of, yeah, of being peaceful and perfect and safe.
Growing up, I always heard that we're a melting pot. We welcome everybody. And as you grow up, you start to see, especially now, I'm really, you know, and it's hard for a lot of people to listen, Cicely.
Yes.
You laugh because you know this. It's very hard for people to listen. Some people, I should say. We talked about, you know, just what I've been seeing on social media from different voices I've been listening to. You know, have those hard conversations with family, have those hard conversations with friends. As you probably know, there are some people, and I have people in my own family that I do not share the same views as. It's impossible to have a conversation with them. You know, it's so should I even bother? Or should I just concentrate on what I know I can change myself, you know, bring my children up in the right way? Or should I really fight? Like, what is my responsibility? Is it to try to change my family who sees things only one way, or?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a lot of people do grapple with that, because you know, it's exhausting regardless of who you are. The when you feel like you're sort of shouting into a void, or like hitting a brick wall, it can be impossible. I think I do think, I do think white folks have a responsibility to continue to have these conversations with family members, because I think that's later on, or later down the line, that saves a person of color having to do it. But, you know, some people are just really stuck in their ways, and it's really difficult. Yeah, I think it is really challenging for people to see outside of their sort of sphere, and to see, to see systemic oppression and to see systemic racism, because, yeah, as I say, it's becoming increasingly invisible, and some of the most, sort of violent forms of oppression are happening completely out of sight, out of mind. So I think there's ways to, um, yeah, to continue to educate folks. One thing that really inspires me is when I see people having conversations about racism in ways that are accessible to them or ways that are accessible to their audience. I think especially in the recent sort of attention on anti-racism, attention on Black Lives Matter, I've really been inspired by people who, who use their own platform or the way that they know best to communicate. So, like, for example, a couple of people that I follow on Instagram, for example, there's this one person, she teaches people how to feed their children in if your children is like a picky eater, she like gives tips. I don't know why I follow her. I don't have children. I just really but then when it came to like all these conversations about anti-racism, she posted this image and it was like how to feed your child if you want to have a difficult conversation over dinner. And she like arranged the food on the plate in a specific way. And I was like, that's so beautiful and powerful that like she didn't change anything of how she usually does her work. Her platform is talking about food and kids. She just gave people a bit of advice on how they could have conversations with their kids while feeding them nutritious food. So I think you don't have to radically change everything about the way that you do things. Like you can, just seeing like makeup brands, like, I don't know, do a makeup tutorial, but also talk about racism at the same time, like people using their platform or like just doing what they do best to continue those conversations. And I think that also makes it sustainable because we're not expecting anybody to like become, an anti-racist consultant, or like we're not expecting, protesting on the streets is not accessible to everyone, especially during a pandemic. So there are ways that you can have these conversations in a way that like makes sense to your community and to to people in your life.
I love that you brought that up because talking to kids is important. We can, as adults, we can all look back on the way that we were brought up and what our subconscious bias may be. What we our greatest teachers are our parents, good or bad. And so, what can whether you're a parent or not a parent, and if you are willing to do the work, what are some things that we can do to educate ourselves and be, as you say, be not only be an ally, but be an accomplice. So how can we all learn to be accomplices?
To me, the idea of being an accomplice is that it really centers anti-racism as sort of a foundation for our life, our lived experience. I see it as a journey. I think allyship is a great place to start. But for me, allyship is kind of a recognition of another's struggle. It could be posting on social media, or maybe having conversations about racism. Accompliship is really recognizing that it needs to be deeper than that. Folks with privilege need to sacrifice something, whether it's monetary gain or reputation, or you will lose followers, or you might even lose friends by speaking out about racism. That's just the reality of it, and people need to be willing to take that step to if they're really committed. I think we're beyond the point of playing it safe anymore. Like we need to see that deeper level of commitment from folks. I think going back to your question around like raising kids, and especially talking to young people about anti-racism, I think we're so fortunate that when I do workshops with young people, sometimes I'm like, do I even need to be here? Like, you folks have got it all sorted. Like, it's much harder to talk to adults about racism, I find. And I think it's kind of just about like, it sounds cheesy, but just kind of like diversifying your life and like the things that you engage with and the things that you have access to. We talked about whether you should like show your kids some some of the harder stuff, and like maybe not.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Because that's it's a lot, whether you're black or white or mixed. Like it can be a lot to be exposed to the more violent and traumatic ways that racism shows up. But I think actually it's more powerful for, especially for younger kids, to just be exposed to positive imagery of people of different races, especially people who are who are often portrayed negatively. And I think that changes. We go, depending on like who's having a war against who, like that changes. Sometimes it's the Russians, sometimes it's Arabs, sometimes it's Black folks. Like this idea of like the bad guy often changes. And I think we just have to continue to provide young people with positive imagery about all people, to show them not only what's possible for them, especially if they're young people of color. They need to see role models. They need to see people who look like them achieving and celebrating and thriving, and not just, it's very hard to shield young people from like, if, so many images out there of Black people dying, like are just out there on the internet. And, I don't think we should necessarily like completely shield people from that. Sometimes that's important, but we also need to balance it out with ways to celebrate and uplift. And especially when it comes to Black culture, we live in a society that overconsumes Black culture. We listen to so much music, developed by Black people. There's so many things that we engage in that Black culture gave us. A lot of slang originates in African American culture. So every day we're sort of engaging with Black culture, but are we acknowledging that it comes from Black culture? Are we celebrating and thanking and paying Black people for that? So yeah, I think it's kind of a process of it's a bit of a fine balance between how much of the hard stuff do we go into. But I think, if you're raising kids who from a young age have an understanding of what racism is, and are also, we also talked about this idea of like, oh, everybody's the same, like there's only one race, I don't see color. And I think sometimes we run the risk of that, because that's what feels natural, right? It makes sense to say that you don't see a difference in people, but unfortunately we do. There is a difference, and people are treated differently. So I think just from a young age, people need to know that we are all different. We should be treated the same, but we are different. And unfortunately, by larger power structures, we are not treated the same.
Well, I can tell you firsthand that parenting is extremely hard. And, you don't know what you're doing as a parent, really, truly, because your kids are different. You've never done this before. It's a massive responsibility. And I had never considered talking to my kids about racism before, because I don't see color. We are all the same. We are all a human race. I understand the danger in that now, and why that's harmful. And I think it's easy for us as parents we want to protect our kids. We want to, right? And so this advice that you're giving is excellent, because there are many great examples of movies that we can show our kids, books that there are so many meaningful things that Black Canadians have done and are doing, and in all of North America, but especially in Canada too. And it's like, how many of our children know about Hogan's Alley in Vancouver? Should we change the way we educate our children and change our curriculum to include more Black Canadian history?
Definitely. I know there's some folks doing amazing work to change some of the curriculum here in BC, because most people pretty much only learn about slavery, if that. And so although, as I say, I think, slavery is hugely important to know about and to recognize the legacy and the impact of it, we can't, base a whole culture or community's history on that one traumatic event. We also have to learn about the accomplishes and the triumphs. And I think that just creates so much more open-mindedness as people grow up. And especially for folks who are Black in schools, to see yourself represented and to know that your history matters too is also really important, because otherwise you spend the rest of your life doing so much work to try to catch up, to build yourself a curriculum of what was missed. And I think, the centering, going back to that idea of centering, when we learn so much about, like, if like an alien came to planet Earth and like went to like a North American school, they would think like World War II is the only thing that ever happened. And while it's really important, there's so much more that can be learned, and there's so many other ways of learning too, like oral histories from indigenous communities. And I think that can be really inspiring and teach us a lot about the past, which can teach us about the future too.
Are you hopeful?
Yes, I am. I'm a Sagittarius, so I'm a very optimistic person. But I do feel, I always feel generally good, but I think at this particular moment in time, it does feel like something's shifting. I do feel like a lot of people are going beyond lip service, which, we always run the risk of when people are just posting black squares on Instagram, or, companies are posting these solidarity statements. As a consultant, I've been sort of keeping an eye on, like, okay, who posts something, but then actually reaches out to me or another consultant for training, for example, or, who's actually following up with programming or with diversifying their workforce and things like that. And so, I do feel like things are changing. And even the fact that like something as radical as the idea of defunding the police is now like on mainstream media and is on the mouths of so many people, whether they agree or not. But just the fact that idea that's, it's been spoken about, it's sort of been, whispered in communities, in activist communities, but it's never like been considered. And to actually see some cities in North America actually considering it, or actually reallocating funding and meeting demands of Black Lives Matter chapters and other activist chapters, it feels it feels like things are changing.
Good. Okay, so before we go, I want you to tell me a little bit about your upcoming book. You have a book, poetry, right? Is it Burning Sugar?
Burning Sugar, yes.
Tell me.
It's coming out on August 31st, so folks can pre-order it now. It is a poetry and essays and letters all in one. I'm quite nervous because it's quite personal, and I think, I'm used to writing like op-eds or like, political pieces, and so this is the first kind of piece of work that's very personal, and I talk about my relationship to like land and identity and race, and the letters that I write in there, most of them are to Black activists, past and present, and Black artists and Black people who've been victims of police violence, kind of like imagined letters to them. So I try to kind of like infuse, basically all parts of my work of like recognizing anti-Blackness as a form of systemic oppression, but then also seeing like the joy in liberation, and hopefully people will read it and feel inspired to be part of the movement in a way that works for them.
It must be nerve-wracking to have your work, something that you worked on and so personal, coming out into the world. I'm excited to read it. Okay, so you have given us so much information. I cannot thank you enough. I could keep talking to you, but I will tell people that for more information, I can tell you firsthand, the conference that is put on by Cicely's consulting company. It's called Stratagem. It's all on social media. You can find it on their website, which is CicelyBlain.com. So that's CICELYBLAIN.com. Everything is there that you need. And then you can find Cicely also on Instagram and Facebook, and Cicely Blain Consulting. Look for Cicely's book, Burning Sugar. It's being August 31st. It comes out. I appreciate you so much for sharing all this information. It is valuable and meaningful, and it's important. And I hope that people listening can learn to be accomplices. We all need to be accomplices as we move forward. So thank you, Cicely.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And be sure to join us here on TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart every Tuesday.